Hey y'all, today we're going to be talking about food chains and food webs. So, food chains show the flow of energy in an ecosystem. A food chain is a visible representation or a visual representation of the flow of energy from the sun to organisms. So, we start off with the sun, and the sun is where producers get their energy from to create their food through photosynthesis. Then those producers are then eaten by a consumer, which is often eaten by another consumer, which would be a second consumer, which is often eaten by a third consumer. The arrows in a food chain represent the flow of energy. The food chain shows that energy moves from the sun to algae, a producer. Zytoplankton, or I'm sorry, not zytoplankton, zooplankton consume algae for energy, and then energy flows from the plankton to the bluegill, then to the osprey.
Sharks are one of the scariest animals in the ocean, and almost nothing else dares to eat them. But if nothing's eating sharks, then why isn't the ocean just overrun with sharks? We can answer the question with food chains. Now, to understand food chains, we first have to talk about food and energy. We eat food during breakfast, lunch, and dinner to give us energy. What do we do with that energy? Well, first, we use that energy to do work, like moving boxes. Second, we use some of the energy to grow. Third, feel your skin. Is it a little warm? We also produce heat when we break down food, so some of the energy in the food is lost as heat. And finally, some of that energy is lost as waste. So remember, we use the energy in food to grow, do work, and produce heat and waste. Animals and plants also get energy from the food they eat, and we can classify them based on the source of their food. Producers are living things that make their own food, like little factories. For example, plants like seaweed and microscopic plant-like creatures called phytoplankton in the oceans make their food by using energy from the sunlight and nutrients in the environment in a process called photosynthesis. Consumers are living things that can't make their own food, and so instead they eat other living creatures. Humans are consumers, and so are sea urchins, sharks, fish, seals, and sea otters. Some living things only eat the waste or dead bodies of other creatures, and these are called decomposers. Shrimp and bacteria are examples of decomposers. These different groups are connected by food chains. A food chain shows who eats whom in an ecosystem. It always starts with a producer because they can make their own food. Then this producer gets eaten by the first consumer, who gets eaten by the second consumer, who sometimes gets eaten by a third and a fourth consumer. For example, seaweed's eaten by the sea urchin, who's eaten by the sea otter, who's then eaten by the shark. Or the phytoplankton's eaten by the fish, who's eaten by the seal, who's also eaten by the shark. Notice that even though the animals might be different, the idea stays the same. The chain always starts with the producer and ends with the consumer. Why is that? Well, a food chain doesn't just show who eats who. Because we get our energy from our food, a food chain also shows the flow of energy from one creature in the chain to another. So a food chain always has to start with a producer because they can harness the energy in sunlight to make food. The energy in this food is then the source of all the rest of the energy that enters the food chain. But remember that living things don't just use the energy in food to grow and get bigger. We also use the energy to do work and produce heat and waste. But only the energy that's used for growth can be transferred through the food chain, since that's what's being eaten by the consumers. So in fact, only about 10% of the energy is transferred from one member of the food chain to the next. That continuous loss of energy means that if you look at the food chain in terms of how much energy gets to each member of the chain, you actually get a pyramid. The producers form the base of the pyramid because they make the food that's the source of the energy. Then with each member of the food chain, energy is lost as work, heat, or waste, and so very little remains for the top consumer. So remember that our motto food chain was composed of the producer, first, second, and third consumer? Now you know why there isn't always a fourth consumer and only very rarely a fifth consumer. There wouldn't be a lot of energy left for that animal. Now you also know why the oceans aren't overrun by sharks, even if there isn't a fourth consumer eating sharks and controlling their population. There just isn't enough energy getting to the third consumer level to support such a large population of sharks. Cool. Now you notice that the shark was the top consumer in both the example food chains, and this is because in the real world, just like how you eat carrots, beef, and all kinds of food, other animals also eat many different things. For example, seals also eat squid and penguins, and seaweed's also eaten by fish and snails. So we have many different food chains all in the same ecosystem. We can then combine all these food chains to make a food web. Since a food web is the combination of the many food chains that exist in the ecosystem, it's a much more realistic picture of what goes on in the environment. Unfortunately, human beings have had huge and terrible impacts on the food webs in the ocean. One way we've done this is by destroying shark populations. Sharks are hunted either for their fins, which are eaten in shark fin soup, or killed accidentally as bycatch when trying to catch fish like tuna. Up to 100 million sharks are killed every year. That's a number bigger than all the people who live in Switzerland, Canada, Cambodia, Denmark, Australia, and Zimbabwe combined. This is bad because, as we saw in our food chains, sharks are the top consumers. This means they keep the populations of other animals in check. So, for example, killing all the sharks would mean more seals, who would need so much fish to support themselves that they would destroy the fish populations. The whole ecosystem would break down. So, what can you do to save sharks? First of all, don't eat shark fin soup. And second, try to buy and eat fish that's been caught without bycatch. Remember, we've said that sharks are the top consumers, but in many ways it's actually human beings. And we need to eat responsibly if we don't want to destroy the food chain.
So let's label producers and consumers in our food chain. So we're going to have P for producers, C for consumers. Producers are anything that create their own energy from the sun. So phytoplankton would start off at the beginning as our producer. Since krill are animals that eat the phytoplankton, they would then be a consumer. Then krill get eaten up by the silverfish, which would be a second consumer. Then those fish are then eaten by leopard seals. So leopard seals would also be a consumer. And then finally, those leopard seals are eaten by orcas, which would be our final consumer. So you see, we've got a lot of consumers and really only, one or two producers. So those producers start off as the first layer of energy, and those get eaten by another consumer, which gets eaten by another consumer, then another consumer, and then you'll have your final top consumer. So let's build our own food chain and identify the different parts of the food chain. So first off, we have our source of energy. Then then a producer uses that energy to create their own food, right? So we're always going to start off with the sun as the source of energy. So our sun's always going to be the source of energy. Then looking at our items, we got a grasshopper, a snake, mice. Our grass is going to be the producer because grass can create its own energy through photosynthesis from the sun. Our primary consumer is going to be the first consumer that we have that eats the grass. So a grasshopper would eat the grass. So the grasshopper would be our final consumer. Now, the secondary consumer is going to be the consumer that then eats the primary consumer, so the grasshopper. So out of snakes and mice, we would say that the mouse is going to be our secondary consumer. And then our final consumer would be a snake. And the final consumer eats the secondary consumer. So oftentimes you'll have like a first consumer, a second consumer, a third consumer, or primary, secondary, and final. You might even have like a fourth or fifth consumer, depending on the food chain. And these arrows in our food chain represent the flow of energy. So those arrows represent the flow of energy. So this arrow from the sun pointing to the grass means that the sun gives energy to the grass. Then the grass gives energy to the grasshopper. Then the grasshopper gives energy to the mouse, and then the mouse gives energy to the snake, all through the process of either, going from sun to producer through photosynthesis, and then from producer to consumer by just eating it. Let's look at food webs. So food webs are basically just a web of multiple food chains. So a food web shows the flow of energy among organisms in a particular ecosystem. Food webs are interconnected food chains. Food webs include producers, consumers, and sometimes decomposers. The sun is usually not shown in a food web, but the sun is always the original source of energy. The arrows in a food web represent the flow of energy. So just like how we were talking about food chains, that those arrows basically point to, what organism is eating another organism or consuming another organism. Just like in our food chains, mice aren't the only things that eat grasshoppers, right? When we were talking about the one just in the slide before, there's lots of things that eat grasshoppers, right? So that's where a food web is really cool to look at because you can see that multiple things will eat other things and consume other things. So let's label them as producers and consumers. So kelp is going to be a producer. Kelp is basically our producer, our plant of ocean life, and that producer is what starts off our energy. So we can see that the kelp, nothing has arrows pointing to the kelp, right? The kelp doesn't eat anything, but instead we've got arrows pointing away from the kelp to the kelp crab and the sea urchin, meaning that the kelp crab eats kelp and the sea urchin also eats kelp. So the kelp crab would be a consumer because it's eating the kelp, and the sea urchin would also be a consumer because it's eating the kelp. Then we can see arrows pointing to the sea lion. So the sea lion is going to consume the kelp crab. It's also going to consume the sea otter. So the sea lion would be a consumer as well. I'm sorry, the sea lion. And then the sea otter also has arrows. So we got that the sea urchin is pointing to the sea otter. So the sea otter is going to eat the urchin. And it's also going to eat kelp crab. So it would also be a consumer. So food webs basically are just like food chains, but they show more than one food chain at a time. And so we can use this food web to create a food chain. So since our kelp was a producer, our kelp would start at the very beginning, right? Because it's what produced the energy for those consumers. Now, let's think about it. What consumed the kelp? If I were to look back at the food web, I've got that the kelp crab and the sea urchin consumed the kelp, so the kelp crab would come next. Now we have to think about what consumed the kelp crab, right? If I look at either the sea otter or the sea lion, both of them could consume the kelp crab, but which one is going to be the top consumer, right? Nothing in our food web was eating the sea lion, so the sea lion would have to be the top consumer, and then the sea otter would have to be our secondary consumer. So this is our food chain using our food web. That we would start out with kelp, then kelp would be consumed by the kelp crab, then kelp crab would be consumed by the sea otter, then the sea otter could be consumed by the sea lion. All right, let's talk about more food webs. So let's watch a food web video to support the claim that sea otters significantly impact the kelp population along the California coast.
Let's visit an underwater forest near Monterey, California, where kelp grows over 100 feet tall, reaching towards the sunlight above. Its fallen blades litter the seafloor below, providing nutrients for a host of creatures, including these spiny purple sea urchins, which move slowly in search of food. Sea urchins make a tasty meal for this marine mammal. Sea otters help keep the sea urchin population in check. Too many sea urchins will devour living kelp, destroying the forest. We consider otters a keystone species. As active predators, they protect kelp from hungry herbivores like sea urchins, and help maintain diversity and balance in this ecosystem. But we're seeing just one small part of an intricate network. Sunflower stars also prey on sea urchins, and may become dinner for a hungry sea otter. But otters prefer abalone and crabs. From the smallest microbes to the largest animals, these species take part in a diverse food web that links more than 1,000 species. The connections in the web represent the transfer of energy with every meal. At the California Academy of Sciences, paleontologist Peter Rubnerine studies both modern-day food webs, like this one, and those from the past.
Basically, a food web is a map of all of the interactions, what we call the trophic interactions, in an ecosystem or community. And those are predator-prey interactions. Who eats whom, who eats you, what do you eat, and so on. The food web is one of, if not the most important representation of interactions that we have in an ecosystem, because it's the main passage of energy through that system. Energy is produced, it's consumed, and everything else runs on that.
Let's take a closer look at our marine ecosystem off the coast of California. What connections do you see in this food web? Can you predict the flow of energy between otters, urchins, and kelp? From primary producers to top predators, this dynamic ecosystem supports a diverse set of species. Small changes, however, can have big impacts across the entire community. Imagine you're a citizen scientist exploring marine ecosystems on the California coast. You visit the same kelp forest every year and observe sea otters, sea urchins, and kelp populations. Looking over your field notes now, what trends do you see? How are otters, urchins, and kelp connected? Take a moment to pause the video and examine your graph. Here we see the impact sea otters have as a keystone species. When otters are present, urchin and kelp populations are stable. When absent, though, urchins boom and kelp beds are reduced. Let's take another look at our coastal food web. Can you predict how a removal of sea otters would impact the flow of energy through the system? Which species would be negatively impacted? Would any be positively impacted? Pause the video to take a closer look. Removal of a keystone species, like the sea otter, has cascading effects, impacting populations across multiple trophic levels and disrupting the flow of energy through the entire system. Understanding ecosystems and the various threads that connect species together in food webs can help us better direct resources for conservation efforts, and, most importantly, come to sustain these diverse networks of life.
All right, so our claim was that sea otters significantly impact the population of kelp in a kelp forest on the California coast. So let's create a food chain. So the food chain shows the flow of energy from kelp to sea otters in the kelp forest. So we talked about it before, that kelp is going to be our original producer, right? Then that first kelp is consumed by a sea urchin. And then that sea urchin is consumed by a sea otter. When otters are present in the kelp forest, the urchin and kelp populations are going to be stable. They're going to be stable. When otters are absent from the kelp forest, the urchin population increases and the kelp population significantly decreases. Because without those sea otters, the sea urchins aren't being consumed as much, so their population is increasing. And since there's so many of them now there's too many of them to eat the kelp, that the kelp can't sustain itself. Sea otters are considered a keystone species, a species that is necessary to maintain a balance in an ecosystem. Sea otters eat the herbivores, like the sea urchin, that consume kelp to keep the kelp forest ecosystem balanced.